Rain has a strange way of turning familiar roads into unfamiliar warnings. Most people think storms are frightening because of the thunder or the darkness, but the real terror lies in the moments when something appears on the road just when you need it the most. And you can't explain why it was there in the first place. Back in 2011, I was still learning what it meant to put real trust in a steering wheel. I had just gotten comfortable enough to drive alone, but comfortable didn't mean experienced. On most days, I was still mentally rehearsing the basics: when to shift, how gently to brake, how tightly to hold the wheel without making my arms stiff. That evening, I wasn't alone. I had friends with me, talking, laughing, and assuming I was far more capable behind the wheel than I actually was. And I let them assume it. I didn't tell them I'd only recently finished learning how to drive. I didn't want their panic to fuel mine. We were somewhere between two small towns, heading home after a long day, when the sky suddenly collapsed with rain. It wasn't a drizzle easing its way into a storm. It came down in one violent sheet, so heavy that even the sound felt like pressure on the roof of my old Maruti Zen. Within seconds, the windshield blurred into a wall of moving water, and the headlights struggled to cut through the falling rain. I slowed down almost instinctively, but the road beneath us was already shining like a river. My wipers swung back and forth with everything they had, but even on max speed, they couldn't keep up. Inside, my mind was a tangle of worries. Is the car going to give up? What if it skids? What if I slide off the side of the road? What if another driver can't see me? I was thinking so quickly that the thoughts barely felt like words, more like flashes of fear layered over one another. My friends were still talking in the back seat, but their voices blended into the sound of the rain. They didn't know how inexperienced I really was. They didn't know that this was my first time ever driving in a storm like this. I didn't want to admit it out loud, especially not when I was supposed to be the one in control. The road ahead dimmed with each passing second until it felt like we were driving inside a dark tunnel made only of rainwater and faint headlights. Cars coming from the opposite direction splashed sheets of water that shook the Zen every time they passed. My knuckles were already white from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Then came the moment that still sits in my memory like a quiet miracle. Through the moving blur, a pair of taillights appeared ahead. Not bright, not rushed, just steady. They blinked with emergency flashes, glowing faintly through the curtain of rain. The car ahead was moving slowly, its caution matching the fear trembling through my own hands. I don't know why those lights calmed me the way they did. Maybe because they were something to anchor my eyes to. Maybe because they gave me a sense of direction when everything else on the road felt unpredictable. Without thinking much about it, I lined up behind the car and matched its speed. Second gear felt safer, and I kept a careful distance, watching the blinking lights like they were a lifeline. Every time the road curved or dipped, I followed its path, almost as if the driver knew exactly where the danger zones were. Rain slammed the car so loudly that it drowned out everything else. It felt like driving underwater, with only those two blinking lights guiding us through the storm. Minutes passed, though they felt much longer. My friends eventually realized how heavy the rain had gotten. They went quiet, tense, but no one said anything directly to me. Maybe they sensed the pressure I was under, or maybe they didn't want to make me lose focus. All I knew was that as long as the blinking lights stayed ahead, we weren't alone in the storm. Eventually, the outline of buildings and dim streetlights appeared through the rain. We were reaching a nearby town safety, or at least a place where the road wasn't swallowed by darkness. The car ahead slowed even further, then turned off to the left, disappearing into what looked like a small service road or alley beside a shop. For a second, I considered following it just to thank the driver. They probably had no idea they had just guided a nervous young driver and a car full of unsuspecting friends safely through a storm. but the rain was still too strong, and the idea of making a sudden turn made my hands tighten again. So instead, I drove forward, parking beneath the weak, flickering awning of a small petrol station. We waited there until the rain finally softened from a punishing roar to a steady drizzle. My friends stepped out to stretch their legs and breathe fresh air, but I stayed inside the car for a moment, just letting my heartbeat slow down. I replayed the drive in my mind, realizing how close I had been to losing control and how strangely lucky it was that the other car appeared exactly when it did. When I looked back at the road, I tried to spot the place where the blinking lights had disappeared, but I couldn't see the vehicle anywhere. The side street it had turned into was empty, dark, and quiet, almost as though nothing had passed through it at all. Maybe it was just another cautious driver making their way home. Maybe it was someone who had driven those roads for years and knew how deceptive they could be in the rain. Or maybe on a night when I most needed help, I just happened to follow the only safe path available, one that showed up at exactly the right moment and vanished just as quickly. Whatever it was, I still thank my stars for that car. Some moments make you realize how quickly an ordinary day can spiral into something completely unnerving. You think you're in control, but in an instant, your sense of safety is stripped away, and there's nothing you can do but react. I was 23, living on the East Coast in a city famous for its relentless monsoon rains. It had been one of those endless grey afternoons where the sky refused to stop pouring, streets turned into shallow rivers, and even umbrellas felt futile. I had just finished a late shift at a small design studio, and my apartment was about a 20-minute walk from the office. I had planned to catch a ride, but all my usual options were either stuck in traffic or completely unavailable. So I decided to brave the rain and head out on foot, armed only with a large tote bag and a raincoat that barely kept the chill away. The streets were nearly deserted. Most people had hunkered down in their apartments or cafes, and the few stragglers I saw were hunched over, navigating puddles that had turned into mini lakes. That's when I noticed him, a man on a motorcycle weaving carefully through the flooded streets. But this wasn't just any delivery bike. Attached to his sidecar was a tub full of small cups of gelato artisanal flavors like lavender honey, roasted pistachio, and salted caramel. Normally seeing him would have been a quirky little delight, a whimsical pause in the middle of a dreary commute. But something about him immediately made my stomach tighten. At first I thought he was offering samples, which was common with vendors trying to entice new customers. But when he saw me, his gaze lingered. He rode closer and motioned for me to come toward him. He held out a cup of pistachio gelato, smiling in a way that felt almost too fixed, too intense. Even as a 23-year-old adult, someone who was used to navigating the city alone, I felt a chill creep up my spine. My gut screamed that something was off. I kept my distance, raising my hand politely to decline. "No, thank you. I'm just waiting for a friend," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't take the hint. Instead, he maneuvered the motorcycle so that he could edge closer, still offering the gelato. His movements were careful but deliberate, almost predatory. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, droplets sliding down his slick jacket. I noticed how soaked he was, but he seemed entirely unconcerned. His focus was on me. I took a step back under the awning of a closed shop, pressing myself against the wall. The sound of water splashing around his wheels mixed with the distant hum of traffic. But the city felt eerily quiet in that particular stretch. My pulse quickened, and I realized that the stranger on the motorcycle had managed to isolate me, even in the middle of a public street. I didn't hesitate. I ran the short distance to the nearby security booth, shouting as I went. "That gelato vendor is following me. I don't feel safe." The guard, a burly man who had been leaning under the shelter, immediately sprung into action. I could hear his boots splashing through the water as he stepped out to confront the man. The gelato vendor froze, his confident smile faltering. For the first time, I saw hesitation in his movements. The guard shouted something at him, warning that he couldn't enter the area if he didn't back off. The man muttered something under his breath, then revved the motorcycle and sped off, disappearing down the flooded street. I could still smell the faint sweetness of pistachio in the air, a strange reminder of how close the situation had been. Even after he left, my heart didn't slow. The rain felt heavier somehow, the streets more desolate. I stayed by the security booth for a while, collecting my thoughts, listening to the patter of raindrops on metal roofs and puddles. It was the first time in years that I realized just how vulnerable you can feel as an adult, even in a city you know like the back of your hand. I had been careful, aware of my surroundings. And still, it had only taken a single, determined stranger to make me feel powerless. I replayed the encounter in my head on the walk home, remembering every detail. The way he leaned slightly off the bike to reach for me, the unnatural confidence in his voice, the precise way he navigated the flooded street without seeming to care about the rain soaking him. And then there was that smile, just a little too wide, just a little too eager. By the time I reached my apartment, soaked to the bone and shivering, I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. My friend, who had finally arrived to pick me up, looked at me like I had seen a ghost. "What happened?" they asked, and I found myself struggling to explain why something as simple as a man on a motorcycle with gelato had left me feeling so unsettled. Over the next few days, I noticed that the vendor hadn't returned to that route. Maybe he had moved on to another part of the city, or maybe the guard's warning had been enough to deter him. Either way, I didn't see him again. But I never forgot that night the way ordinary streets had felt suddenly isolating, how someone's intentions could make the most mundane act feel threatening, and how small, quick thinking could be the difference between feeling trapped and making it out safely. Even now, years later, when it rains heavily and I walk through city streets alone, I can't help but glance at the sidecars and motorcycles passing by. There's always a moment where I remember the wide smile, the pistachio-scented air, and the sharp, urgent feeling that made my heart pound and my steps quicken. It was a brief, terrifying experience, but it taught me something vital about being aware, trusting instincts, and understanding that danger can appear in the most unexpected forms, even something as innocent as a sample of gelato. It's funny how our brains latch onto certain details. The exact sound of water splashing under a tire, the angle of someone's lean on a motorcycle, the faint scent that lingers long after they're gone. That night, all of these details combined to create a memory that I will never shake. A lesson about caution, instinct, and survival lessons that, strangely, came wrapped in a sweet, cold cup of pistachio gelato. Some storms don't just bring rain, they can create situations where you have to be extra cautious. Something horrible came with the rain. I'm visiting my brother's cabin in Washington State. He let me come here after my divorce, get away from all the nonsense and clear my head for a couple weeks. It's beautiful out here, the quaint little hut exactly what I had been expecting. It's surrounded by dense forest and you have to take a long dirt road to reach it. It's wonderful. Before I arrived, my brother informed me that he had stocked the hut with groceries, enough to last a month if I decided I wanted to stay that long. He was leaving it up to me, knowing what hell my breakup had been. I had lost almost everything, and as a gesture of goodwill, he had extended a hand and offered his cabin to me. It was a welcome sanctuary, and upon arrival I found myself blissfully calm. The woods were alive with sound, the creak of wood, the gentle rustle of wind through the leaves, the chirp of birds in conversation. It was all so serene. The first couple days were wonderful, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. The horrible legal battle I had been engaged in with my wife had taken the wind out of my sails. But out here I let the warm breeze envelope me with new life and energy. To my surprise, it had been beautiful the first couple days, the gentle golden rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy of green overhead. The first 3 days I spent a lot of time walking through the woods, isolated from everything and everyone. I was alone out here, a stranger to the surrounding green kingdom. I let my mind wander free from the chains it had been bound with, my thoughts drifting towards what I would do with my new life. Possibilities began to blossom before me, and I actually started discovering hope in my future again. But then the rain came. I had heard on the news that a 7-day storm was headed my way, so it came as no surprise when the sky darkened. As a resident of Washington, I was no stranger to long bouts of rain, and this was no different. I had just finished eating dinner when the rain started, gentle pitter-patters on the roof, that eventually evolved into a full-blown gale. I started a fire and pulled a chair up to the window, watching the storm. It was cozy, and I found peace in watching the chaos that I was protected from. And then I heard something on the roof, which sounded unusual and made me alert. At first I thought it was just the rain, but after a few moments I realized it sounded like someone was running around up there. I wasn't sure what caused it. It could have been a larger animal. I grabbed the blanket off of the chair I was sitting in and pulled it up to my chin, creeped out by the noise. After a little bit, the sound stopped. My heart was in my throat, and my eyes darted to the front door. Thunder boomed overhead, and I suddenly felt incredibly far away from civilization. I shivered, despite the fire, and turned my eyes to look out the window I was sitting in front of. Lightning flashed, and I suddenly leaned forward, heart racing. Something wasn't right out there. I thought my eyes had to be playing tricks on me, and I anxiously waited for more lightning. I forced myself to calm down, sure that what I had just seen was paranoia brought on by fear. The world was illuminated once again by a bright blast of lightning, and my eyes went wide. Mere feet from the window, the rain seemed to bend around the shapes of 3 invisible figures. They stood about 6 feet tall, the rain outlining their still forms. I swallowed hard, waiting for another blast of lightning, and when it came, the shapes remained. They were immobile, and I suddenly felt eyes on me, as if they had come with the storm to watch me. I retreated from the window, feeling exposed and afraid, and went and sat on my bed. I was terrified, so shaken by the bizarre forms that I began to have a hard time breathing. I took a few long, deep pulls of air, willing myself to settle down. As my heart rate slowed, I started convincing myself that I had imagined the shapes. Between the rain and the dark, it was easy to mistake shadows and shapes that weren't actually there. Just as I was about to get back up, I heard something walking on the roof again. I gripped the sides of my bed as I listened to the heavy footsteps walk closer, and then finally stop directly over my head. I crawled between my covers and held my breath, eyes wide in a panic. What the hell was out there? Another flash of lightning lit the sky, and I glanced at the window. It was right there, its invisible form parting the rain like a curtain. It was watching me. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the covers over my head. I heard myself whimpering and slapped a hand over my mouth. What were these things? What did they want? And then a thought slammed into me with the force of a locomotive. Where was the third one? And that's when I heard the front door crash open. I cried out in fear, shaking like a child as heavy, wet footsteps walked across the cabin towards me. It stopped by the side of my bed, and I felt drops of water falling from its body onto my blanket. I could hear it breathing, a sucking sound pulled deep into its moist lungs. As I bawled into myself under the covers, terrified, it spoke. Look at me. Its voice sounded like rain, an odd, stuttered inflection of its vocal cords. I didn't move, didn't breathe, praying that this nightmare would end. I didn't know what these things were, what they wanted, but I sensed danger. I sensed they wanted to hurt me, and I sensed that if I looked at them, they could. I stayed balled up under my blankets and kept my trembling mouth shut. "Look at me," it repeated in the same wet voice, its words dribbling from its mouth like running water. Again, I didn't move. I was absolutely paralyzed with fear. I kept my eyes closed and the blanket firmly over me. My stomach churned with terror and my breath was hot in the enclosed space. I don't know how long I waited. Eventually I heard the thing retreat, slamming the door behind it. Even after the noise stopped, I stayed alert and watched the rain fall steadily outside. I don't know if I fell asleep or passed out, but the next thing I remember was opening my eyes to dim grey light. I hesitantly pulled the blanket from me and surveyed the cabin. The fire had died out, and the scene before me was still in the early morning light. The rain still thundered overhead as sheets of it were driven from the dark sky. I slowly got out of bed and went to the window. "Please," I muttered, voice cracking. The three figures stared back at me, the rain outlining their still figures. I dropped to the floor, out of sight, a hand to my chest. I crawled over to the small kitchen and reached up to retrieve my cell phone. It wasn't there. I jumped to my feet, scouring the surface for where I knew I left it the previous night. I couldn't find my phone where I had left it, which left me frustrated and unsure what to do next. "What do you want from me?" I screamed. "What do you want from me?" The storm offered me no answer. "Leave me alone," I whispered. "Just leave me alone, please." It's been 3 weeks. The storm hasn't ceased. I don't know what's happened. Something is seriously wrong. The sky remains a dim grey, the day-night cycle stuck in some horrific limbo. I don't think I'm ever getting out of this cabin. I'm almost out of food, and I wonder how long I can last before starvation drives me outside these walls. I remain cautious, aware of the ongoing storm outside. When I hear one of them running across the roof, I sprint to my bed and bury myself under the covers. As soon as I do, another slams the front door open and comes to stand over me. It tells me to look at it, commands me to look at it. I can't, I won't. Something about its voice has begun to sound familiar. The more it speaks to me, the more I have begun to recognize it. It sounds like me, and last night, when one of them was standing over my bed, it said something different. It told me that things should have been different. It told me it was disappointed in the way my life had turned out. It told me I needed to acknowledge my mistakes. It told me it was time to let another one of them try.